Hello, this is Anne DeGheest. It's April 30th, and this is my clinical insights video. You don't want to miss my first video. A lot of great news, fantastic news for the US. We're doing fantastic. I mean, honestly, I'm speechless after 1 year of saying bad news, and I know a lot of you thought it was depressing. It is good news, so go see my first video. You'll feel better. Unfortunately, that's for the US. Case down 20%, and we have done a great job on vaccination. Bad news is that India and South America are out of control, and we have to really be careful that these variants that's driving their cases comes back, and Europe seems to be stabilizing. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to avoid long COVID by getting vaccinated. I'm going to try to explain this alphabet soup of the mutations, the variants, and the strain. What do they mean? The new CDC mass guidelines, and then some of the debunking of the vaccine hesitancy. So please follow my video, use those arguments with other people there. Your job is to help spread the word and then convince people around you to get vaccinated. So what is a mutation? A mutation is, if you look at the virus, it's made of what's called ribonucleic acids, RNA. And the RNA is on a regular basis mutating itself. And unfortunately, it makes errors. It's not very accurate there. And so an error is what we call a mutation. And so, for example, N501Y, and I'll explain this a little bit more in the next slide, is a mutation on place 501 on the RNA between the N the N has replaced the Y. And the problem with that specific one is that it increased the binding of the virus to the ACE2. This is ACE2, I'm sorry, it's a typo there. Now, a variant contains several mutations. So for example, the B117, which is the UK variant, has 2 mutations, okay? So it's like a building block, like a Lego there. So you have several mutations makes a variant. If this variant have physical properties that they change drastically how they act and the consequences of it, this is not qualified as a strain. Okay, so these are the 3 different terminologies. Let me explain what that means. This is the parental strain, which is a Chinese one. And it starts mutating over time, and that creates these different variants. And when you start getting enough of this mutation, they call this a new strain. So to make things a little bit more complicated, let me go to the next level there. So there's around 30,000 letters in the RNA, but it only makes 29 proteins. That's the good news. So when I talk about that N501Y mutation there, which you're going to hear a lot about it, it's the amino acid asparagine, the N, that is replaced with tyrosine, the Y, at the 510 position. That's what it means, okay? And of course, that's the one that basically increased by 50% the infection rate, and it lasts longer in your body, lasts for 14 days, has a higher load, so you need less of it to get infected. It's a nasty thing. And unfortunately, it's in the B117, which is the UK variant, and the B1351 from South Africa and Brazil. These are the ones that are creating all these problems in the world. The E484K is a substitution of the glutamate, the E for the lysine, at the spike protein 484. So these are all on the spike protein, okay? And the reason why it's a problem there, because that's the one that's evading the antibodies, and people who had antibodies because they had been infected before by a different variant or by the existing vaccine. And unfortunately, that's the one we see in South Africa and Brazil. And if you look at my first video, that's the problem in Brazil. Is that this damn thing is avoiding antibodies. AstraZeneca, for example, is absolutely ineffective in South Africa. It has 0 protection. It's totally evading the vaccine. Sinovac has also a problem in Brazil. We'll talk more about that. And Pfizer and Moderna, the mRNAs, are 50% less effective. Still some protection there, but you should expect a 3rd shot to increase the protection. So, and unfortunately, in the US is only doing less than 1% sequencing there. So we're not really knowing what's going on in the US. So let's look at the lineage. So the original lineage was A for the Chinese route from Wuhan. And then we had the first major change. That was the B variant, the haplotype, which happened in Europe. And the big change in Europe was the Italian outbreak in the spring of 2020. And then as the thing starts to evolve, you have these subgroups there. So this was the A and then the B. And as we see significant mutation, that's why you have the B117. So it's the UK lineage with the N501Y mutation. When the thing gets too complicated, then they start, you start getting too many numbers there. Then they start a new strain, which is the C strain. Okay, does that make sense? I hope you can follow that. So to give you an idea, the B117, which tells you how quickly this variant can dominate the world, basically was identified for the first time in December in the UK and is now across the world in a matter of 1, 2, 3 months. And that is really the big danger we have right now. We have to vaccinate as many people in the world to stop this virus to mutate so it avoids the existing antibodies that are being created by the vaccine. So B117 in 4 months has pretty much taken over the world. Very, very, very fast. And what we don't want is this Indian mutation to travel back and take over the world, because that one is claimed last year. We know B117 is not effective and cannot stop the vaccine from the mRNA. mRNA is effective for B117. But to give you an idea, in the US, you can see in a matter of 3 months, it basically took over the US. You can barely see it here. And then by April the 10th, it's basically the dominant in the US. That's how quickly these variants can take over. So some real world efficacy data, clinical trial is one thing, it's tightly controlled. What you really want to see what's happening in the real world. CDC just released data yesterday from 24 hospitals in 14 states, looking between January and March, which is very recent data there, looking at the population of people over the age of 65 years old. If you had 1 shot, you had 64% efficacy. If you had a 2 shot, they confirmed the 94% efficacy. And again, that means you really need to get that second dose to really be protected there. So good news, real world evidence shows that the efficacy they found in the trials is in the real world. And that was very important because it's not always the case. Serbia did also some really interesting real world evidence there. And so they look at 28,000 people vaccinated versus 100,000 people unvaccinated. So these are serious data sets. And what they find out is that if you get hospitalized, you had a 50% lower risk of getting hospitalized if you had been vaccinated. Pneumonia was 15% lower risk. And after 3 weeks after the second dose, you had a 92% efficacy. So real world evidence show it works. But then they show some differences by type of vaccine. This is the first time I've seen this. You can see AstraZeneca, has still a 2.3% infection rate and a pneumonia risk. The Chinese vaccine Sinopharm had, one of the highest pneumonia risk and still an infection rate. And this is again, Serbian and Belgradian data. Sputnik claimed to have good data there, but you're going to see there's people disagreeing with that. And Pfizer has the best ratio, 0.1% pneumonia rate and 1% infection risk. So i.e. The most effective one. So Kremlin, which is the Sputnik 5, is the second most approved vaccine in the world. They have been approved in 52 countries as of March and cover a population of 1.4 billion people. Unfortunately, it's a bit unclear how effective it is. So they had a publication on the Lancet, but and they claim 91% efficacy after the first dose, which is kind of surprising how high it is. They've just been rejected by Brazil authorities. They passed despite the fact that Brazil is having all these problems there because they show poor effectiveness against the P1 variant. But they're winning the vaccine race because they have this attitude. It's like a space race. And it's a politically driven there. And so there is a very big disinformation campaign going into the US, unfortunately driven by Russia, to discredit our vaccine and creating a lot of hesitancy in the US. They also want to basically fragment the European soft bloc. So they've been trying to make deals in Italy and France and Spain and Germany. So far, they've done a good deal in Hungary and Slovakia, which are old Eastern Bloc countries there. And they try to aggravate a lot of the coordination within the EU. So unfortunately, politics is playing a big role in this vaccination there. And they're not providing this for free. This is a commercial approach to selling this to make revenues. China is doing the same thing. So China is doing a great job at the expectation game. They're very good at public relations there, which is significantly perceived to be higher than the true vaccine effectiveness. We know that the immunization data, the evidence that's coming out, is showing a lower efficacy rate than the Western mRNA vaccine. But people cannot get access to Pfizer and Moderna there. So they're basically developing contracts in Hungary, Turkey, Albania, Bosnia, Serbia, all developing contract there. And it's interesting because they're selling it before there's been any top regulatory approval. And by that, I mean major countries there. So the EU has not even reviewed it. The World Health Organization is looking at it to say, okay, you're above the 50% threshold, which is what the initial target was. And they're selling them before they give it to their own populations there. Brazil have done some real-world evidence data on Sinovac. They show a range that's between 51 to 82%. And this is the bad news. In Brazil, they show that the efficacy after the first shot is only 16%. And that is the problem they're having in Brazil, where people think that they may get some protection when in reality they don't have a protection that's high enough. And in Chile, they also shown that it goes from 16%, so similar to Brazil, to 67% after the second shot. So for some reason, that second shot is really critical in the Chinese. And remember, the Chinese vaccine is a very different mechanism of action than the mRNAs. So you have to get your second dose. 8% of the US have not taken their second dose. That's around 5 million people there. A big problem are college students who got vaccinated on campus and now they're into a different state. And so the US just announced that they're expanding access to pharmacies, that if you go to any pharmacies in the country and you have a document showing the first dose anywhere in the US, you should receive the second dose. You have to make sure that you show them the vaccination proof. So if you have Moderna the first time, you get Moderna on the second one there. And that has been basically launched with all the US pharmacies that are working on the federal program. So CVS, Walgreens, a lot of the public sites. So please, get your second shot. And just to reinforce, the mRNA vaccine will not affect your DNA. That is from the CDC. Let's talk about vaccine hesitancy. 35% of Americans under the age of 35 years old, sorry, mistyped that, do not want to be vaccinated. And that is a problem there because it put us at risk our ability to get to the herd immunity that's calculated to be between 70 to 85%. It unfortunately gives an opportunity for the virus to mutate and create a new surge, because now there's a pool of patients there that can mutate. And I think this is what I'm going to spend a bit more time on, is that people need to be concerned about their personal protection. Long COVID is real. There's a 10 to 30% chance that you will develop brain fog, chest pain, shortness of breath, cardiac injuries for life or for at least a year. It is expected right now that 50% of those people will not be able to go back to full-time work. And so we create a new class of disabilities. I'm going to spend a bit more time on that. And this is a lot of unbearable symptoms. And I just listened yesterday to long COVID hearing, which I'll talk a little bit about it in the end of this presentation. So hang in there. So I'm going to give you some debunking argument. If people around you are hesitant to take a vaccine, let's kind of go for the argument and how you may be able to convince them. Unknown long-term side effects. The FDA asked for only 2 months of data after injections there. Historically, if you look at most of the serious vaccines, polio, smallpox, yellow fever, all those vaccines, all the side effects showed up in the first 6 weeks. So therefore, when the FDA gets at least 2 months of data there, they feel pretty strongly there that they have identified all the potential side effects. Another thing that needs to be debunked is vaccine may hurt my fertility. Somehow people have been spreading that. It's absolutely false. There's absolutely no evidence that people have lost any fertility. If you look about how the vaccine is working, it has absolutely no impact on anything to do with fertility there. And ironically, if you get pregnant, you are at a higher risk for severe COVID, as well as the baby, if you get the virus while you're pregnant there. Another one is that this is none of your business. What do you care? Because you're vaccinated, so leave me alone. Well, vaccines, unfortunately, are not 100% effective. So you can still infect other vaccinated loved ones. So you may still be a carrier, and you may accidentally bring the virus to people. I got now 2 cases of people who were vaccinated who took care of grandchildren there or children there who had the virus because they thought they were protected. They all got the virus. If you get exposed to people on a regular basis who are infected, you will get it. And here's the problem. It enabled the virus to mutate into a vaccine-resistant variant and the risk of a new pandemic risk, which we talked about in the first video. The other argument you're going to hear is that I am young and I'm healthy, therefore I'm invincible. I'm a mom, so I've heard that before. The B117 is now the dominant strain, and unfortunately, we talk about 50% more contagious there. 30% risk of becoming long COVID patient. And I'm going to share in a few minutes there that 15% of long COVID, of people who have basically get infected, develop long COVID in the children and the young population there. Why would you take a risk of wrecking your life for the rest of your life? And so the issue there is not the 0.5 to 1%, 1.5% mortality rate. People say, hey, that's 99% of the time I'll be fine. It's really the fact that you have up to 30% chance of never be the same for the rest of your life. That is the very big issue that I think we need to talk more about it. It turns out that younger people have a stronger immune system, which means they have a high risk of developing a cytokine storm and being on ICUs and ventilators and other type of systems. Another things you may hear is to say, hey, it's only emergency use authorization by the FDA. It's not fully approved by the FDA. I'm going to wait until it's fully approved. And the only difference is the length of the follow-up. Typically, we see efficacy of 1 to 2 years. And right now, we haven't seen that. But the real-world evidence is showing it is efficacious. I just shared with a few minutes there. It's really showing efficacy there. Another argument you may hear is that I already got COVID. I don't need a vaccine. Well, it turns out that most people lose their antibody after 6 months. My family in Belgium all lost their antibody after 6 months. You did a second dose, and it's recommended you wait 90 days after the infection there to get the second dose to build the antibodies from the vaccine last much longer than the antibodies you get from being infected. I don't want to get COVID from the vaccine. There's absolutely no real COVID cases in any of the vaccine approved in the US. There is no way you can get COVID from the vaccine available in the US. My faith will protect me. Unfortunately, 26% of evangelical Protestants are hesitant. And I says, the argument I think with those friends of yours is that we don't die from smallpox anymore. Children aren't permanently paralyzed by polio anymore. It is a good thing to do vaccine. We do it for children. Why not COVID? Another argument, I can afford it. Somehow there's a lot of misinformation about it. It is free of charge. It is paid by the government. So not getting vaccinated could set everyone back. And so you just need to be aware of that herd immunity is really critical for us to stop the virus to mutate and bounce back and hit everybody. So please, help me spread the word, use some of these arguments, share these videos. We need to really encourage people, to basically get vaccinated. The CDC just issued new guidelines for people who are fully vaccinated. Still, if you go to a barbershop or go to a crowded area there, you still recommend that you get a mask. Same thing for any kind of indoor activity like a restaurants or a chorus or, highly crowded area there. But the good news is that if you are between friends and you want to be outdoor, they pretty much says, you can basically remove the mask. If, of course, it's a very crowded outdoor events like, a sports event, you still need to protect yourself there. And, of course, unvaccinated people there, now they're saying if you're outdoor with a small outdoor gatherings there, you don't need to wear a mask. But otherwise, of course, especially crowded area that you do need to wear a mask. So this just came out a few days ago. So on the other good news side, Abbott just released an at-home test kit there, which is $24 for 2 tests, or around $12 per test. They have pretty good positive, sensitivity and specificity there. So if you have some concern, you could be exposed. This is something that you can now buy and use at home, and it's being sold by all the major pharmacies chains. Let's talk about long COVID. We have been focusing last year on the mortality rate, which is now around 550,000 people died. And on all the people in the hospital, which has been 4 to 5 million people. Here's the bottom of the iceberg there. This is below the water there. We have probably between 50 to 80 million people who have been infected there. And 10 to 30% of those may develop long COVID. And what is long COVID? It is really very complicated because we have some people who have been on ventilator and they have what's called post-ICU problems there. And then you have other things that may be masking themselves. So it's hard to define. In fact, the name hasn't been approved and people are still arguing about the name. But let's talk about the latest name, which is post-acute COVID syndrome, or sequelae is another way people are saying the PACS. And if you do the math, it could be 8 to 22 million Americans who have been infected, who are fighting long COVID symptoms there. And the US healthcare system is absolutely not equipped to handle that population. And they report between 100 to 200 different symptoms with organ damage to the heart, the lungs, the brain, the kidney, and the pancreas. Pretty much everything in the body that has an ACE2 receptor, which is pretty much everywhere, is damaged by the virus. It unfortunately requires help from multi-specialists with multiple imaging and blood diagnostics and testing, which of course is what we're terrible at in the US, is this integration of care. As a result of that, most of the primary care providers have been ignoring those patients there. So there's extremely high frustration, anxiety, and depression in that population. So what are some of the symptoms? The most common one is intense fatigue. It's like chronic fatigue syndromes. These patients will go up a flight of stairs and they're just exhausted there. It turns out that when the doctor tells them, just go exercise, you'll feel better, that's the worst advice you can get. It turns out if you do exercise too quickly there, through progressive rehab, you may get yourself set back and get worse. A lot of these people feel chest pain, acute chest pain. They also have cognitive problem. It's really like a traumatic brain injury, like a concussion. It's not like dementia. It's really like a brain fog. They have shortness of breath, which could be due to cardiac or lung problems there. They've lost their taste of smell even after 9 months. They have accelerated heart rate where they go from 60 beats per minute to 160 beats per minute suddenly there. And most of them have sleep disorder problems. So what are the issues? Well, we know that there is what's called post-viral syndrome. It turns out Ebola and Zika, which were two other nasty viruses we had in the past, had the same kind of little virus reservoir that was hiding inside the body that was continuously spreading the virus over time. People believe it's a full neurological injury from head to toe. Every neurological system in the body gets affected there, which creates some of the symptoms we saw. We know the autonomous nervous system, which is the way your heart rate and your blood pressure works, is basically taken out of wax. POTS is the word for people who have this big heart racing their problem. And then chronic fatigue, the medical name is myalgic encephalomyelitis, and that is a very big issue there because these people cannot function and they can no longer work. So to give you an idea, 3/4 of people hospitalized with COVID have at least one ongoing symptom 6 months after the acute illness, and that just got reported from China. If you were hospitalized without oxygen, so you're not as severe as the first group I mentioned, 20% of these patients who did not require oxygen have decreased lung function after 6 months. So they've damage to their lungs. And that means that could be for the rest of their life. If you were mild and asymptomatic, which is the majority of the population, surveys have shown in different parts of the world that these people, between 35 to 50%, have persistent symptoms. And the data has been shown in different parts of Europe is that they've shown cardiac symptoms in other people up to 7 months afterwards. Most of this, a lot of neurological symptoms. And this data is very clear that there's something happening to the virus damaging the nerve system, the peripheral as well as the main central nervous system. This is unfortunately multidimensional. And so these patients have issues with pain, physical function, weakness, an ability to function and remember what people are telling them. And you can see that in blue, this is kind of a normal subject. This is kind of this type of interesting graphic there. This is somebody discharged from COVID there or when they had the infection there. And you can see they're not really progressing. After 6 months, a lot of them still have a lot of damage and problems there. And that's kind of the problem of that disease is that you don't have that quick recovery that you will have with another virus. So what are the latest news? Data just got published in Nature saying that people who have been infected, non-hospitalized, so the majority of them are asymptomatics, have a 60% higher risk of death within 6 months. So there's a lot of what's called this damage there that's simmering there that could trigger a higher mortality rate. And you have 20% higher chance of requiring outpatient care for new chronic diseases that got triggered by the disease. And this is to give you an idea of some of the graphic there that it basically hit everything: musculoskeletal, mental, infectious health, sex, digestive, circulatory, blood. I mean, it's the whole goddamn body that's being affected there. This is to give you the long list. You can see there's a lot of simple there, but these are acute pulmonary embolism there, cardiac arrhythmias, malaise and fatigue, respiratory sign. I mean, this is a lot of problems. This is to give you an idea of the hazard ratio, which is a ratio of 1, which is the red dotted line here, is what the average population here. And you can see there, I mean, it's affecting every organ, every major system in the body there. So please, this is the real risk of COVID. It's this long COVID risk. That's the one, if you have a 10 to 30% chance of having this damage for the rest of your life or for a very long period of time, that is why you need to be vaccinated. Another news, CDC just came out with a study coming from Georgia. And what it shows is that 69% of non-hospitalized patients, again, the mild cases there, had to have an outpatient visits within 6 months. And then 1/3 of them had to see specialists there. And these are all the symptoms. I just mentioned that. So these are staggering numbers. So it is a real It is not a thing. People are not anxious. It's not a hysterical woman. This is reality. This is a true risk of COVID. It's not the mortality. What are the causes? Well, that's the problem. We do think there's clearly something happening with the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. It's clearly affecting the heart. We believe there could be other causes. Clearly, people have been in hospitals with post-complication, but that's a small part of the population there. We know that the disease during the acute phase has blood clots, which can create, strokes and pulmonary embolism, and that famous cytokine storms, which the younger population is at high risk there. So you have all these capillaries damage that can have long-term consequences. There is not an increasing assumption there that it could be a viral reservoir like we've seen with other viruses. And that may be explained why some patients with long COVID, when they take the vaccine, they suddenly feel much better. It's like, basically flush out the virus out of the system there, but to be seen, that's not confirmed. We know the autoimmune system, there is a trigger of an inflammation there that can trigger some other autoimmune disorders that you may be at risk of. And there is clearly most of these patients in what's called dysautonomia, which is that what is the normal self-regulated unconscious management of the body is out of whack. And that's your blood pressure, your blood vessel constriction, your sense of sleep, your sense of controlling of temperature. And we know the virus is infecting and damaging, like your olfactory nerve. It turns out it could be the nerve around it from what I've read. So there was a hearing yesterday. This is on YouTube. They just posted the hearing. It's around 6 hours, so hang in there. It's a lot of good information, but I'm going to summarize my key takeaway. There were 2 panels. The first one was Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and Dr. John Brooks, the head of CDC, and then with physicians from Yale, UCSF, and several patients advocates sharing their experience there. In my mind, there is a crisis. And this is my interpretation of the hearing. There's no accountability and no sense of urgencies. We're talking about millions of people who are not getting the care. Will it be diagnosed or being treated there? The patient are being ignored by the primary care provider. There's a stigma and a disbelief that this exists. We absolutely need to work on this. This is even worse than HIV. The access of care is massive. I talked to several specialists this week, and they told me that on the average, a patient, when they come to them, which is, they run COVID clinics, they've had 7 what you call unhelpful plus emergency room visit where they will basically not believe or ignore. In addition to that, it's creating a problem for the poor as social demographic because they were hit the hardest. If you remember in my prior videos, the Black and the Hispanic were infected at a significantly higher rate than the white population there, and they're the one that having a hard time fighting for themselves to get health care. To make things even more complicated, most of these patients were healthy before. So the payers are saying, hey, I'm not paying for CT scanners because this was a healthy patient before. So there's a problem in people getting enough diagnostic and rehab for their treatment there. Mental health is a huge issue. Most of these patients have anxiety, depression, and psychosis. The virus is triggering a chemical change in the brain that creates a lot of these issues there. This is not their perception. It's not in the head. It is a chemical change in their brain. What is not helping is that there is no ICD-10 that's specific to long COVID, and there is no extra CPT reimbursement code. We have known this for a year, and they're still talking about it. There's a lack of coordination between the CDC and the CSF. Yeah, they're talking about it. Well, what are they waiting for? In addition to that, we need to get the FDA involved the same way we did for the vaccine by basically having a process for emergency use authorization for repurposing drugs. So we can basically try on this patient and see what works, the same way we did with COVID. So I've been working with Congresswoman Anna DeGheest there, who is the chair of that committee there, to really try to force a sense of urgency and try to help the Biden administration to realize that they need to do something that's a long COVID effort on a much bigger scale. That's where it's happening right now. So what are the issues? We need a private-public collaboration. This has to be something that has to be on a big scale. Right now, the Biden administration, a couple of months ago, announced a $1 billion, but it's mostly done for academic research. There were 373 submissions by a major academic center to define what is long COVID, what's the name of it, and what does it mean? How do we define it? What's the mechanism of action? That alone may take a year. In addition to that, the NIH is trying to build a meta cohort. They want a very large scale database so they can do analysis. That is true, but in parallel, we need to take care of these patients there. And so they want to identify predisposition factors, do a lot of imagings, record all the symptoms, find the biomarker. There's no obvious biomarkers right now. And then basically do several interventions and see what works. And then we need, after we figure this out, we need to do therapeutic research because the analysis, is that we need to find out the mechanism of action before we can do therapeutic interventions there. And that could take more years. If we had done with COVID, the mortality rate in this country would have been horrible. And so we need that same type of effort. So we need efforts on anticoagulant immunosuppressants. We need to do breathing rehab, cardiac rehab, do traumatic brain injury rehab for the brain fog, titrate different vaccine to see if maybe that will help people. Maybe it's a repeat vaccine. And then this is a big problem. The CDC needs to educate 550,000 primary care providers that long COVID is real and is eliminated as stigma. So when the question was asked to the head of the CDC, they said, oh, we do a webinar. I went on their website. There was one webinar for the last 4 months on long COVID there. And that's as evidence evolves. So there is nobody that's really in charge of dealing with this. And I really think it's something that, we all need to start making a lot of noise about it. So we need to shift the public education efforts that long COVID is the really risk of not being vaccinated. It's not the mortality. This is the real risk. And these are horrible consequences. So we need at-home virtual access for both diagnostic and therapeutic. So I am trying to do something in this area. If you're interested, contact me. I'm very easily findable. You can find me on the internet. And I hope you all stay healthy. Please get vaccinated. I'm going to be moving these updates to a monthly cycle. The next one is going to be May the 28th and then June the 25th, July 30th. So these are the last Friday of every month, if you remember that. So please stay positive, wear a mask and get vaccinated, and use my video update to spread the word and encourage other people to get vaccinated. It is really critical, not only for them, because you love them, but also for us, so that we don't allow these variants to come back and haunt us. So please be healthy, and we'll see you in a month.